"Sir, your daughter's breathing is not optional." The words cut through the cafe like a blade no one expected, and for a moment, everything stopped. Conversation, clinking cups, even the distant hum of Manhattan traffic beyond the glass windows. William Carter, billionaire and single father, stood frozen beside the table where his 7-year-old daughter, Olivia, had just collapsed seconds earlier. His voice, usually calm in boardrooms where millions shifted with a sentence, now cracked as he shouted for help that felt suddenly too far away. "Someone call 911, he demanded. But the cafe staff was already moving too slowly, too shocked, too unsure. That's when Ava Johnson stepped forward. A quiet black waitress with an apron slightly stained from a long shift. She didn't hesitate, didn't ask permission, didn't look at anyone for approval. She simply moved. "Sir, I need space," she said firmly, her voice low but absolute, like someone who had spoken that tone in emergencies before. William turned sharply, anger flashing through panic. "Stay away from my daughter," he snapped, but Ava was already kneeling beside Olivia, her eyes scanning in a way that didn't match her uniform, her hands steady in a way that didn't match the chaos. She checked the child's pulse, observed her breathing, and tilted her head with careful precision. "Airway restriction," she said quietly, almost to herself, as if solving a problem she had seen before in another life. The cafe went silent except for Olivia's faint, uneven breaths. William hovered helplessly, torn between trust and fear, watching a stranger take control of the most important moment of his life. Ava didn't look at him again. "She has less than a minute," she said, her tone unchanged, as if time itself had just become her responsibility. And in that moment, as the world narrowed to a single fragile heartbeat, William Carter realized something terrifying. Money, power, and influence meant nothing here, because the only person who seemed to know what to do was the woman everyone else had ignored. And just as Olivia's condition reached its most critical point, Ava's eyes shifted slightly towards something behind the counter, something no one else in the room had noticed yet, something that would change everything they thought they understood about her. The cafe felt different in the seconds after Ava Johnson stepped in. Not louder, not quieter, but tighter, as if every person inside had suddenly become aware that something irreversible was unfolding in front of them. William Carter stood frozen beside his daughter, his hands slightly raised as if he could somehow hold time in place through force of will alone. His eyes kept shifting between Olivia and Ava, struggling to accept that a waitress was now the only person moving with certainty in a room full of panic. Ava stayed focused on Olivia, her fingers steady as she checked the child's breathing again, her expression unchanged, as if she was reading a familiar pattern rather than witnessing a crisis. "She is not getting enough air," Ava said quietly, her voice controlled but urgent in a way that made William's stomach tighten. "Has she eaten anything unusual in the last 20 minutes? William blinked, trying to process the question through fear. "She had a pastry and orange juice," he said quickly, his voice breaking slightly. Ava nodded once, already shifting her attention, scanning the table, the floor, the half-finished drink, the small plate with crumbs left behind. Her eyes stopped for just a moment on the pastry wrapper, then moved toward the counter behind her. Something in that direction pulled her focus away for half a second, a detail no one else in the room had noticed. The cafe manager was still speaking into a phone, repeating the address of the location, but Ava was already halfway to understanding something deeper than the emergency itself. "Do you have any allergies in her medical history?" Ava asked without looking up. William hesitated. "Peanuts," he said finally, as if the word itself felt like it weighed too much. That single answer changed the air in the room. Ava stood smoothly, not rushing, but moving with a purpose that now had structure. She turned toward the counter area where staff stored supplies, her eyes locking onto a small cabinet beneath the espresso machine. It was not open. It was not labeled, clearly, but something about it made her pause just long enough for William to notice. "What are you looking for?" he asked, his voice now lower, almost lost beneath the rising tension of uncertainty. Ava did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped behind the counter with permission that no one had explicitly given her, but no one had the presence to stop. Her hands moved quickly through instinct rather than guesswork, opening the cabinet, scanning its contents in seconds. Cups, cleaning cloths, syrup bottles, and then a small emergency kit tucked behind the rest. She pulled it out carefully and placed it on the counter, her expression tightening just slightly as she confirmed what she suspected. William took a step forward. "Is that for her?" he asked, his voice cracking again. Ava finally looked at him directly for the first time since this began, and in her eyes there was no panic, only clarity. "Yes," she said softly. "But we are running out of time faster than you think." And in that moment, William realized that whatever Ava Johnson had been before this cafe, whatever life she had hidden behind a quiet uniform and a tray of cups, she was not guessing her way through this. She knew exactly what she was doing. The emergency kit sat open on the cafe counter, its contents neatly arranged in a way that told William Carter this was not unfamiliar territory for Ava Johnson. She did not hesitate, did not fumble, did not ask for help. Instead, she scanned every item once, then moved with a controlled urgency that made the rest of the cafe feel like it had slowed down around her. William stood a few feet away, unable to decide whether to trust her or demand that she step aside. But every second Olivia's breathing grew more fragile, and indecision became a luxury he no longer had. Ava's voice cut through the silence again, calm and precise. "I need you to stay focused on her face," she said, not looking at William but clearly speaking to him. "If she responds, even slightly, you tell me immediately." William nodded quickly, stepping closer to his daughter, his hand hovering just above Olivia's shoulder without touching, as if afraid even contact might break something already fragile. Ava worked with steady precision, preparing what she needed from the kit while keeping her attention divided between observation and action. Her movements were not rushed, but they carried an unmistakable sense of experience that made it clear she had done this before in environments far less forgiving than a cafe in Manhattan. The cafe itself had become almost entirely silent now. Customers had stopped pretending to eat or talk. Phones were lowered. Chairs were still. Even the staff who had initially panicked were now watching Ava instead of the emergency responders still en route. William finally spoke again, his voice lower, controlled but strained. "How do you know what you are doing?" he asked, as if the question had been building inside him since the moment she stepped forward. Ava paused only for a fraction of a second, her eyes still on Olivia. "Because I have seen this pattern before," she said simply. "And because hesitation is the only thing that makes it worse." There was no pride in her tone, no attempt to impress, only fact. She adjusted Olivia's position carefully, checking her breathing again, then reached for a small device in the kit, her fingers steady as she prepared it. William felt his throat tighten. Every instinct he had was to take control, to demand explanations, to assert authority, but nothing in this moment responded to authority. Only action mattered. Ava leaned slightly closer to Olivia, speaking in a softer tone now, not to the father, not to the room, but to the child. "You are going to be okay," she said gently, her voice carrying a calm that did not match the urgency of the situation. Then she looked up briefly at William. "She is still with us," Ava added, "but we do not have much time before her body stops compensating." The words landed heavily, not as fear, but as reality. William closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, forcing himself to stay present. "Do whatever you need to do," he said, his voice breaking at the edges. Ava gave a single nod, and in that instant something shifted in the room again, not louder, not more chaotic, but more focused. As she continued, William noticed something else about her hands, the way she positioned them, the way she checked angles and breathing rhythm, the way she seemed to understand invisible systems inside the human body with quiet certainty. It was not guesswork. It was knowledge built from experience he could not yet place. And as Ava reached for the final step in her response, the cafe door in the background finally opened, and footsteps from arriving responders echoed through the room. But Ava did not look up. She was already finishing what she had started, as if the outcome had always depended on her being the first one to act, not the last one to arrive. The cafe door swung open wider as emergency responders finally entered, their footsteps quick and controlled as they scanned the room for the source of the call. William Carter felt a wave of relief surge through him at the sight of them. But it was quickly complicated by the fact that Ava Johnson had not moved from Olivia's side. She was still focused, still steady, still in control of the final moments of her intervention, as if the arrival of professionals only confirmed the responsibility she had already taken. One of the responders called out, asking for status, but Ava answered before William could even speak. Possible allergic airway restriction, unknown trigger from food exposure, she said clearly, her tone precise and clinical. The responder paused for half a second, clearly registering that the information was unusually specific coming from someone in a cafe uniform. But there was no time to question it further. Ava carefully adjusted Olivia's position one final time, then slowly stepped back, giving space without hesitation. William immediately moved closer to his daughter, his hand trembling as he watched the responders take over. One of them began assessing Olivia, confirming her breathing stability and preparing supportive care, while another checked details from the cafe staff. The atmosphere shifted from chaos into structured urgency, but William's attention kept returning to Ava, who now stood slightly behind the counter, watching everything with quiet intensity. She was no longer acting but observing with the same focus she had shown from the beginning. William approached her, his voice lower now, stripped of authority and replaced with something closer to disbelief. "You knew exactly what to do," he said, searching her face as if trying to place her in a world he understood. Ava did not immediately respond. Her eyes briefly flicked toward Olivia, then back to William. "I recognized the signs early," she said simply. "That made the difference." William shook his head slightly, still processing what had just happened in under a few critical minutes that had felt like hours. "That was not just observation," he replied. "That was training." For the first time, Ava hesitated, just for a moment before answering. "It was," she said quietly. The word carried weight, but she did not elaborate. One of the responders looked over at her again, this time with more direct curiosity, as if reassessing what role she had played before their arrival. William noticed that shift and felt another layer of confusion settle in. Ava was not a typical waitress who happened to act quickly. She spoke and moved like someone who had spent years in environments where hesitation meant consequences. As Olivia was carefully stabilized and prepared for transport evaluation, William stepped slightly aside, still watching Ava. The cafe around them slowly began to return to motion, but it was a different kind of motion now, subdued and careful, as if everyone understood something important had just occurred in their space. William finally spoke again, his voice quieter. "Why are you working here?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question he could not reconcile. Ava met his gaze briefly, then looked away toward the counter as if choosing her words carefully. "Because not every skill follows a straight path," she said. "Sometimes people end up in places that do not reflect everything they can do." William studied her for a long moment, sensing there was more beneath her answer, something not yet offered. Before he could respond, a responder approached them, confirming that Olivia was stable enough for immediate transport and further evaluation. Relief washed over William, sharp and overwhelming, and for a moment he could not speak. When he turned back toward Ava to thank her properly, she had already stepped slightly away, returning to the quiet space behind the counter, as if her role in the moment had already ended. But William did not look away, because in that instant, he realized this was not just about what she had done. It was about who she was, and why someone like her was hiding in plain sight in a cafe in Manhattan. The cafe had settled into a strange kind of silence after the emergency responders left with Olivia Carter, but the energy inside the room had not returned to normal. It lingered in the air like a memory that refused to fade. William Carter stood near the counter, his hand still loosely holding his phone, but his attention was no longer on logistics or follow-up calls. It was on Ava Johnson. She was now calmly wiping down the counter, returning cups to their proper place, moving with the same quiet rhythm she had before everything happened, as if nothing about her world had changed in the last few minutes. But for William, everything had changed. He stepped closer again, this time without urgency, without panic, only curiosity and something heavier underneath it. "You said you recognized the signs," he said carefully, watching her hands as she worked. "But that was more than recognition. You knew exactly how to respond." Ava paused for a fraction of a second, then continued wiping the counter. "Knowing what to look for is not the same as guessing," she replied calmly. William nodded slowly, absorbing her words but not satisfied with them. "People do not react like that unless they have been trained," he said. Ava finally looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Training does not always stay in the place it was learned," she said quietly. There was a weight in her voice now, something controlled but deliberate, like a door that had been opened slightly but not fully. William studied her more closely. The uniform, the cafe name tag, the simple appearance that had fooled him at first glance, none of it matched the precision he had just witnessed. "Who are you really?" he asked, his voice lower now, no longer demanding but searching. Ava did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the window where city traffic moved on, as if nothing extraordinary had happened inside this small cafe. "Someone who knows what it feels like when seconds decide everything," she said finally. The answer was not complete, but it was honest enough to make William pause. He looked down at his hands, still slightly trembling from adrenaline that had nowhere to go now that the crisis had passed. "You saved my daughter," he said, the words finally catching up to him fully. Ava shook her head slightly. "I gave her time until help arrived," she corrected gently. "That is all." But William knew it was not all. He had seen the difference between panic and control, between hesitation and certainty, and there had been no hesitation in her at all. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "I owe you more than I can put into words," he said. Ava stopped what she was doing again, this time turning fully toward him. Her expression softened just slightly, but her posture remained firm. "Then do not try to put it into words," she said. "Just make sure she is okay." That simplicity struck him harder than any request for money or recognition would have. Before William could respond, one of the cafe staff approached nervously, asking if everything was under control. William nodded absently, still watching Ava, but she had already stepped back into motion, returning to her work as if the moment no longer belonged to her. He realized then that she was not waiting for gratitude, and she was not seeking attention. She had already moved on from the moment that had defined everyone else in the room. And that realization stayed with him longer than anything else, because people like her did not act like this without reason, and William Carter suddenly understood that the real story had not even begun yet. The afternoon light outside the cafe had begun to shift, stretching long reflections across the glass windows. But inside, William Carter still had not left. The emergency had passed. His daughter was now in medical observation, and yet something anchored him in place far more strongly than obligation or fear. It was Ava Johnson. She moved behind the counter with steady repetition, restocking items, cleaning surfaces, resetting the space for a world that had already moved on. But William could not. He finally stepped closer again, lowering his voice as if afraid to disturb the fragile normality she had rebuilt. "You did not just act quickly," he said carefully. "You acted like someone who has done this before under pressure." Ava did not look up immediately. Her hands paused for only a moment before she continued organizing the shelf. "People think emergencies are chaos," she said calmly, "but they are usually patterns. If you recognize the pattern, you do not panic." William nodded slowly, but his eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in realization that her answer was too precise to be casual. "That is not something a waitress learns," he said. Ava finally met his gaze, her expression controlled, almost distant. "Not everything I do now reflects what I learned first," she replied. There was a quiet resistance in her words, like she was drawing a line between her present and something she did not want to reopen. William studied her for a long moment, then lowered his voice further. "You are not just a waitress," he said. Ava exhaled slowly, returning to her work without confirming or denying it. That silence said more than any answer could. A few feet away, the cafe manager was speaking quietly with staff, still shaken by what had occurred. But even they kept glancing toward Ava with a new kind of attention. William noticed everything now. The way she positioned herself in space, the way she scanned the room instinctively, the way she never turned her back fully to movement. These were not habits formed in a cafe. They were habits formed in environments where awareness meant survival of outcomes that could not be reversed. William stepped back slightly, running a hand through his hair, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "My daughter would not have made it to medical care in time without you," he said finally. Ava stopped again, this time longer. She placed the cloth down and turned fully toward him. For a brief moment, her composure softened, not into weakness, but into something quieter, something human. "Then she was already lucky," Ava said gently. William shook his head. "No," he replied. "Luck does not do what you did." The words hung between them, unresolved. Ava looked away toward the window again, where the city continued moving as if nothing extraordinary had happened inside this small cafe. "Sometimes people only notice you when something goes wrong," she said quietly. "But that does not mean that is the only time you matter." William absorbed that in silence, feeling the weight of it settle deeper than he expected. Before he could respond, his phone vibrated again with an update from the hospital. Olivia was stable. The relief that followed was immediate, almost overwhelming. But even as it hit him, his eyes remained on Ava. Because for the first time that day, William Carter understood that saving his daughter had been only one part of what had just occurred. The other part was realizing that the woman standing behind this counter was carrying a past powerful enough to stay hidden in plain sight, and he had no idea why. The hospital update had come and gone, but William Carter remained standing in the cafe as if the floor beneath him had quietly changed shape. His daughter was now stable under medical supervision, the immediate danger no longer present, yet his attention could not detach from the woman behind the counter who had made that outcome possible. Ava Johnson continued her work with calm precision, stacking cups, resetting stations, moving through familiar motions that no longer matched the extraordinary moment she had just come through. William finally stepped closer again, slower this time, as if approaching something fragile and not fully understood. "My daughter is alive because of you," he said quietly, no longer questioning, no longer analyzing, only acknowledging. Ava paused, her hands resting on the counter for a brief moment before she resumed organizing items with careful control. "She is alive because help arrived in time," she replied evenly. William shook his head slightly. "That is not the full truth," he said. "I was there. I saw what happened. You did not hesitate for even a second." Ava exhaled softly, her gaze shifting toward the window again, where the city moved on without pause. "Hesitation is what costs people more than anything else," she said. Her voice carried something restrained, like a memory held just below the surface. William studied her more closely now, not as a businessman assessing a situation, but as a father trying to understand a person who had changed the outcome of his life in under minutes. "You said before that you have seen patterns like this," he said carefully. "That is not something most people can say." Ava finally looked at him fully. There was no pride in her expression, only distance, as if she was measuring how much to reveal. "There are places where you do not have the luxury of uncertainty," she said. "You learn to see things quickly, or you do not get a second chance." The words settled between them, heavier than anything else said that day. William nodded slowly, absorbing the implication without pressing further, but his curiosity only deepened. "Why leave that world?" he asked gently. Ava's expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in restraint. She looked down at her hands for a moment before answering. "Because sometimes what you survive is not something you return to," she said quietly. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer filled with urgency or crisis, but with something more complex, something unresolved. William took a slow breath, realizing he was standing in front of someone who had already lived through more than most people ever see, and chosen a life that no longer reflected it. He looked toward the door of the cafe, then back at her. "I do not know your story," he said honestly. But I know what you did for my daughter. Ava gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if accepting the statement without attaching meaning to it. William reached into his jacket, pulling out a card, then hesitated before placing it gently on the counter rather than handing it directly to her. If you ever decide that your past or your skills matter beyond this place, he said, his voice steady but sincere, I would like to know. Ava glanced at the card but did not pick it up immediately. Her eyes lingered on it for a moment, then shifted back to him. People usually want explanations before trust, she said softly. William met her gaze. I have seen enough to understand I do not need one right now, he replied. For the first time since the incident, Ava's expression softened slightly, not into agreement, but into recognition that something had shifted. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, unaware that inside a small cafe, two lives had intersected in a way neither of them had fully defined yet, and William Carter now understood that what had happened to his daughter was not the end of a moment, but the beginning of a question he would not be able to ignore. The cafe was beginning to return to its normal rhythm, but nothing about the atmosphere felt ordinary anymore. Even the sound of cups being placed on tables seemed quieter, more careful, as if the entire space had been reminded that moments like the one that just happened could not be undone or ignored. William Carter still stood near the counter, his presence no longer commanding the room but anchoring it. Ava Johnson had returned to her routine work, yet William's eyes kept following her every movement, searching for something he had not yet been able to name. He finally spoke again, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for several minutes. I am not asking you to explain your past, he said carefully, choosing his words with more caution than he used in boardrooms that moved billions of dollars. But I cannot ignore what I saw today. Ava paused briefly, then continued arranging items with steady hands. You do not need to make it more than it was, she replied softly. I responded to a situation. That is all. William stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice as if the conversation itself required privacy. That is not all, he said. People do not act with that level of precision without experience that matters. Ava finally looked at him again, her expression calm but firm. Experience does not always belong to the life you are currently living, she said. The words hung in the air between them, subtle but heavy, suggesting a divide in her life that had not been crossed in a long time. William nodded slowly, but he did not step back. Instead, he glanced toward the card he had left on the counter earlier. It had not been touched. You did not take it, he said. Ava followed his gaze for a moment, then returned her attention to her work. I do not make decisions based on single moments, she said. William considered that answer carefully, recognizing it as someone who had learned restraint in ways most people never had to. Then when do you make decisions? He asked. Ava paused again, this time longer, as if the question reached something deeper than the surface conversation they were having. When silence lasts long enough to show you what is real, she said quietly. Before William could respond, his phone vibrated again. Another update. Olivia was improving steadily, responding well to observation, no complications detected. Relief washed over him again, but this time it was different. It did not erase what he was thinking about. It intensified it. He looked up from the screen, his attention immediately returning to Ava. She is getting better, he said. Ava gave a small nod, as if she had already expected that outcome. Good, she said simply. William studied her for a long moment, then took a slow breath. I want to understand something, he said. Not because I owe you anything, but because I think I would be making a mistake if I did not. Ava stopped what she was doing, finally giving him her full attention. The cafe around them continued to move quietly, but their space felt separated from it. William continued, his voice steady but more personal now. If you were just someone who happened to know what to do, I would say thank you and leave it there, he said. But you are not that simple. Ava's expression did not change, but her silence acknowledged the truth of his observation without confirming anything further. William nodded slightly, as if accepting that he would not get clarity easily. "I do not know what you are running from," he said, "but I do know you are not standing still by accident." Ava's gaze softened slightly, but she did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked past him toward the window again, where evening light was beginning to replace afternoon brightness. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower than before. "Not everything that follows you deserves to be brought forward," she said. William absorbed that quietly, recognizing that whatever her past contained, it was not something she offered freely. The conversation paused there, not ending but suspended. William slowly stepped back, understanding that pushing further would not bring answers, only distance. "If you ever decide that silence is no longer enough," he said carefully, "you know where to find me." Ava gave a slight nod, neither accepting nor rejecting the statement. William turned toward the door, but before leaving, he looked back once more. Ava had already returned to her work, blending back into the rhythm of the cafe as if nothing had changed. But William knew better now. Nothing about this moment was ordinary, and the real weight of what had happened today was not in what had been seen, but in what had not yet been revealed. William Carter stepped out of the cafe into the late Manhattan evening, but the noise of the city felt distant, almost muted compared to what had just happened inside. The glass door closed behind him with a soft finality, yet he did not immediately move toward his car. Instead, he stood still on the sidewalk, replaying every moment in his mind. His daughter was safe. That fact alone should have consumed all his attention, but it did not. His thoughts kept returning to Ava Johnson. Inside the cafe, Ava continued her work as if the world had not shifted around her. The counter was clean, the remaining cups were arranged, and the space slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Yet something about her presence felt unchanged by time or recognition. She was not waiting for acknowledgement, nor did she appear to expect it. She simply existed within the flow of her environment, steady and controlled. William finally opened the passenger door of his car but did not get inside immediately. He looked back through the glass window one last time. Ava was now speaking quietly to a coworker, her tone calm, her movements precise, blending into the background again as if the extraordinary events of the day had never touched her. That contrast stayed with him more than anything else. He had spent his entire life building systems he could control, people he could influence, outcomes he could predict. But none of that applied to her. She had stepped into chaos and restored order without asking for permission, without seeking recognition, and without revealing anything about herself in the process. William finally entered the car, closing the door as the driver waited for instruction. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, quietly, he gave the address to the hospital where his daughter was recovering. As the vehicle pulled away, he looked out at the city lights, but his mind was still inside that cafe. Ava Johnson was not a mystery he could simply walk away from, because what she had done had already changed the structure of his reality. Back inside the cafe, Ava finished her final task of the evening and removed her apron with steady hands. She folded it neatly, placed it behind the counter, and prepared to leave as if nothing unusual had occurred. Her coworker glanced at her briefly, still unsettled by what they had witnessed earlier, but Ava offered no explanation. She simply gave a small nod and walked toward the exit. When she stepped outside, the cool air met her without ceremony. The city moved around her as it always had. She adjusted her coat slightly and began walking down the sidewalk in the opposite direction from where William had gone.
No pause, no hesitation, no backward glance.
And as she disappeared into the flow of people and light, one truth remained unspoken but clear. William Carter had not just encountered someone who saved his daughter. He had crossed paths with a past that refused to stay buried, and the real story of Ava Johnson was still waiting to be told.